committee congressional investigator. We have Jessica Roth, and we also have Joe Moreno, two former federal prosecutors. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being here. Marcus, I do want to start with you. What was your reaction today to this guilty verdict? Not just a guilty verdict, but this was handed down on all 34 counts, wasn't it, by the jury?
It was. I think what the DA said was pretty important. We were just doing our jobs. And that's the way I think the prosecution and the government should look at criminal cases. It's not something to be celebrated. In fact, it's a pretty solemn day to see a former president convicted. But it is a great day to see our institutions doing what they're supposed to do, which is hold everyone accountable to the law. Everyone, whether you're a former president or someone like me and you who may have committed a crime. And so my immediate reaction was that I'm happy to see our institutions holding up. One of my main concerns, as we've seen from the January 6th report, is the attack on our institutions, whether it be Congress's ability to certify an election or states to make a decision on an election, and now on our judicial system. We've seen attacks on it for the past year or so. And so I'm just happy that our institutions are holding up and that 12 impartial jurors were able to go in and make a decision after hearing evidence from the prosecution, hearing crosses from the defense, and make a ruling in a way that seems like it's business as usual.
Jessica Roth, also with us, a former federal prosecutor of the Southern District of New York. What were your thoughts today? What was your reaction when that verdict was read out by that jury?
I agree. Today was a historic day and a sober day. I was gratified to see that the criminal justice system worked in an orderly fashion. And I thought that it was remarkable how quickly the jurors returned a unanimous verdict of guilty on all 34 counts. But it was apparent that they didn't rush, in my opinion. They took 2 days of deliberations, and critically, they asked to have testimony read back to them and to get clarification of some of the jury instructions. And the testimony they asked for and the particular instructions of law that they asked to have read back, in my mind, showed that they really were honed in on some of the critical issues in the case. They wanted to hear again David Pecker's testimony, which essentially was the start of the prosecution's case and the start of the narrative about the scheme with Michael Cohen and Donald Trump to catch and kill stories that were negative for Trump in the lead up to the November 2016 election. David Pecker corroborated Michael Cohen's testimony about that scheme. And David Pecker had absolutely no bias against Donald Trump. He had no axe to grind with him. And the jury asked for instructions about accomplice liability, which is the legal mechanism by which Donald Trump can be held accountable and was held accountable by this jury for the falsification of the business records of the Trump organization, even though he personally did not necessarily falsify each and every one of those records. So that said to me that the jury was really focused on what the issues were in the case, and they took their job very seriously.
We also have Joe Moreno with us, former federal prosecutor as well. And just reflecting on what Jessica said there, what did you make of the way that these cases were laid out by the prosecution and by the defense? Do you think that the prosecution really played its cards right, and that the defense simply, in the end, the evidence was too strong to try to defend?
You know, Carl, I'll echo the sentiment of my fellow guests in respecting the rule of law, and I will respect the fact that the jury did its job. However, I maintain this is an absolutely nonsensical case. I believe that this was absolutely not just doing Alvin Bragg's job, the prosecutor. Remember, he ran on the notion of prosecuting Donald Trump for something. They sat on this case for 6 years and then launched it just in time for this year's election. The entire theory of the case was incredibly creative. The ball was hidden until literally closing arguments after the defense had rested. And the judge twisted himself in pretzels in order to assist the prosecution. So I believe this case is replete with error. I do believe it will be reversed on appeal. And I think the entire thing is an absolute travesty.
Marcus, what do you make of that, of what Joe just said there?
Look, I clearly disagree. 12 jurors also disagreed with that. I think there was a lot of documentary evidence the prosecution put forth. I view this as a pretty classic white-collar case where you have clear payments made from the former president to Michael Cohen, who was made to fix and kill a story in the lead up to the election. I actually want to go back and say I thought that the prosecution's narrative about why the records were falsified, I thought that was pretty important. And a lot of folks thought it might have been a stretch of a case theory, but the 12 jurors clearly did not think it was a stretch. And that was that this these stories were killed, right? They got taken off the air because of the election. And we had testimony that after the Access Hollywood tapes in December were aired, that the Trump campaign was really in a panic mode. And that's what really precipitated and encouraged and led to these payments. And I thought that the prosecutors laid it out in their opening statement. It came through in every witness testimony. It came through in the documents. It was corroboration upon corroboration. I thought the jury instructions were pretty standard as well. And I thought that the jurors were very deliberate in asking about certain jury instructions, asking, as we heard earlier, about testimony being read back. And I think this was a pretty standard white-collar case. The only thing that wasn't standard about it, and maybe this is a critique in our justice system that people are now just seeing, but was just the defendant. But otherwise, it was a pretty standard case from what I could see.
Jessica, I want to turn to you because we heard something there from Joe Moreno saying that he expects that this case will be overturned on appeal. Can you walk us through what you expect might come next? We are pretty certain that this verdict will be appealed, won't it, by Donald Trump?
Oh, it will absolutely be appealed. He will be sentenced, and he will appeal the conviction and the sentence, whatever it is. He will take his first appeal to the appellate division, which is the intermediate court in the state of New York. He has an appeal as of right there, so they have to consider his appeal. And then depending on what happens there, if they were to reverse it, it would go back to the trial court, and there could be potentially a new trial. If they upheld the conviction and sentence, then he could seek further appeal in the highest court of New York State, which is the New York Court of Appeals. But that is not as of right. So he would actually have to be granted an appeal there.
Do you think that he has grounds for an appeal? Do you think that there are legal grounds here that President Trump's lawyers could bring that would have any strong legal basis?
I think there are legal questions that the appellate courts would take very seriously. And I think that those would include this use of the New York election law, the conspiracy statute that makes it a crime to conspire with others to promote an election through unlawful means, and that being used as the felony that essentially elevates what would otherwise be the misdemeanor of falsification of business records to a felony itself. I think the courts would look seriously at the use of that statute, which is in and of itself a misdemeanor. And then the fact that that statute was used in turn to incorporate by reference other provisions of law, including federal election law, as the unlawful means pursued by the conspiracy. That is a novel use of these statutes. And so I'm sure that the appellate courts would look very seriously at whether that was legally permissible. I don't believe it's been done before. There may also be some evidentiary issues that the courts would look seriously at, including the testimony by Stormy Daniels that included some very salacious details about her encounter with Donald Trump. I don't think that those ultimately would prevail on appeal, primarily because Donald Trump did not object in a timely manner when she was testifying to them. But I think those two areas would be the primary grounds for the appeal.
Joe Moreno, coming to you now, and I know you don't think that this case will continue. You think that the appeal might be successful, but let's say it's not. 34 counts, each count carrying a potential fine or up to 5 years in prison. I do believe that the cap here for the total amount of time that could be served is 20 years. What do you expect, though? Do you think we'll see a former president behind bars? And what would that mean, do you think, for the country and for Donald Trump?
When Alvin Bragg was elected, I say this as a former New Yorker myself, he went through a litany of all the cases that he refused to prosecute. So the idea that now he would opt to send a first-time offender to jail for a nonviolent crime, normally I would say that's absolutely ridiculous. But you know what? This whole trial has been ridiculous, so I fully expect they will shoot for jail time.
Well, it won't be in Alvin Bragg's hands, will it? This will be the decision of Judge Merchan.
Yeah, he will advocate for it, certainly. And so both sides will advocate for their positions. And so Alvin Bragg has a huge role in how much he pushes for what the sentence should be. So it absolutely will be in his hands as far as a contributor. And yes, well, ultimately Judge Merchan will rule on it. Again, I think it's been shameful how far Judge Merchan has gone to help Alvin Bragg's prosecution team. And I have to say, Marcus, respectfully, there's nothing standard about this case. In the jury instructions, the fact that they allowed the jurors to choose one of 3 different crimes in order to elevate this to the felony one of which the tax crime wasn't even discussed during the trial. I mean, I think that's absolutely absurd, and there's nothing standard about this case.
Well, Joe, I wouldn't give Marcus a chance now to respond to what Joe just said there.
I want to put it back on Judge Merchan's hands, like you just put it on. I mean, he is the person who's going to be making this ruling on the sentencing, and I think it's important that we both know, we all know that the prosecutor is going to advocate for a certain sentence, and it might be for jail time. As the correspondent noted earlier, I think the violations of the gag orders is going to play into the recommendation of the sentence. I think the lack of remorse that we're seeing post-trial, that we're seeing on social media right now, will play into the sentencing arguments. And the defense, I'm sure, will point out everything that Joe just mentioned, first-time offender, a white-collar crime. And so I think that is what Judge Merchan is going to be weighing. But I wouldn't say that confinement's out of the question, although it would be probably pretty difficult.
These are big questions to weigh, aren't they? And you're someone who's worked on the January 6th committee, which also involves so many similar issues. Right. What do you think it would mean if we did see some sort of jail sentence for a former president?
Look, I'm all for just accountability of the law. I think the former president piece of it shouldn't even play into the judge's decision, right? What really comes into is the facts of this case. The fact, the aggravating circumstances of what happened in 2016, what has happened while the trial's played out with the defendant's behavior, that is the only thing that the court should be considering. They shouldn't be considering the fact that it's a former president. And I think that's important for allowing the American people to have confidence in the system of what the former president has had to go through and what thousands of other Americans go through every day. And so that's what I hope the court, and what the court has done so far, has been very careful to treat the former president with respect and to make rulings that I think are pretty careful and well thought out. And I expect nothing less from the judge as we move into sentencing.
We have seen Judge Merchan throughout this case have to make several difficult rulings. He has seemed to give Donald Trump a fair amount of leeway when it comes to what he's been posting on social media, for example. And Jessica, I want to come back to you, and if you could put yourself in Judge Merchan's shoes now. July 11th will be a big day. That will be the sentencing. There will be some arguments, as well as you mentioned, about an appeal. But if you were in his shoes, how do you think he will handle such a monumental day of sentencing involving a former president?
I think he will handle it methodically and dispassionately, and I think that's what we've seen throughout this trial. One of the reasons why there is this adjournment of several weeks between the verdict and the sentencing is for the parties to make submissions to the court of what they think the sentence should be and why under the law and given the facts about this individual. And also for the judge to get the benefit of input from the probation office of the court, which would have the opportunity to interview the defendant and gather facts and bring that to the attention of the judge. And so there's this pause in which there will be information gathered and presented to the judge, and he will have the opportunity to consider those submissions and take all the facts and circumstances into account in deciding what he thinks is an appropriate sentence. As has been mentioned, he has a great deal of discretion here under the law of New York about what that sentence can and should be. And he will take all of that into account, as well as the defendant's conduct during this trial, I think, and not just the conduct that gave rise to these charges of which he now stands convicted.
And of course, there will be plenty of political fallout as well. It's very, very likely that Donald Trump will be running for president in November as a convicted felon. I want to thank our panel. With me in studio, Marcus Childress, a former January 6th committee congressional investigator, white-collar lawyer. We have Jessica Roth, former prosecutor of the Southern District of New York, and Joe Moreno, a former federal prosecutor. Thank you to you all. Be sure to follow all of our